It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 112. Hello, and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between the 1860s and 1930. And in this episode, I'll be talking about the conflating of two of the biggest double crosses in the history of professional wrestling. But first, in way of an update this week, I've had enough of the WWE's new philosophy of profits over fan satisfaction. Who would have thought that anybody could make Vince McMahon look like a babyface again with all the revelations about him and his personal life that have come out in the last couple of years? But the new TKO version of maximizing our profits doesn't seem to account too much of how much fans are going to have to chase around their content or how much money they're going to have to spend. I tapped out on pro wrestling a couple times. I didn't realize that before I started talking about it a few months ago. I had actually tapped out on it from 1991 until 1994, and Bret Hart as world champion in WWE kind of brought me back into being a wrestling fan again. And then I tapped out for 2011 till about 2016, 2017, where a friend of mine who I used to work with got me watching Ring of Honor. I am going to make a couple of changes over the next few months. I don't think you'll even notice it, but it was a suggestion my oldest son Trey made. He said, "You always try to sit down and do the episode in one take, and so you're always running up against your deadline." He said, "Have you thought about just recording clips of different things and then putting the show together that way?" And I thought that that was actually a really good idea. For one thing, I could produce a number of clips on an afternoon of main content for a number of episodes and then fill in with some of the things that I see during the week and I want to comment on. And by the time we get to the podcast, I've forgotten about. I'm going to play around with the format of the show a little bit. So we may have some new segments and get rid of some of the old segments. Thinking about WWE's philosophy over the past year or two, maybe 3 years, got me thinking about the state of professional wrestling. And I agree with Dutch Mantel's take. I don't think you can kill professional wrestling. But let's face it, professional wrestling plays to a much smaller audience today than it ever has in the past. Each iteration of the national expansion from the 1980s, you lost fans. So today, the WWE pretty consistently draws 2 to 3 million fans for their television shows. That's a pretty consistent fan base watching their television product. But in the 90s, that was 6 to 8 million people. And WCW, or they were drawn between 5 and 7,000 fans. So you could have between the combined audiences, because there was some crossover, 10 million people watching. Did I say million or thousands? 5 to 7 million people watching WCW and 6 to 8 million people watching WWE. But between the crossover, they figure the audience probably maxed out around 10 million for both shows. That's 10 million people. That's 7 million people that have gone away from professional wrestling and didn't come back. And I was one of them. And you also have now Tony Khan pretty consistently draws 5 to 700,000 fans to his shows, which is down from the million, 1.2 that he started with. A lot of those were casual fans. But both companies have done a tremendous job of running off their fan base. Vince McMahon spent 20 years trying to kill his business, but he couldn't do it. And Tony Khan has run off, a fourth to a third of his audience. And the shame of it is he's had to run off some of the hardcores because they're people that are going to try to watch AEW and give it the benefit of the doubt, no matter what. The one difference I'll say now than the Monday Night Wars, I think there was a lot of audience crossover in the 1990s. We watched both Raw and Nitro. I knew most people watched both Raw and Nitro. That you might record one, but you were watching both of them during the week. There is some crossover in wrestling fans today, but there's this tribalism that has developed where you're like a WWE fan and you put down AEW all the time, or you're an AEW fan and WWE is horrendous. I will say I think mixed martial arts has really negatively impacted both professional wrestling and professional boxing. They pulled a lot from both of those audiences. Because I'm trying to watch all of the primetime wrestling before it moves somewhere else and I don't know where it ends up at. I'm actually looking at the primetime wrestling shows from 1989 right now because once Bobby goes off and has his own show, primetime wrestling was never the same again after that. And so that's the July 10th, 1989 show. So once I get to there, I'll just fast forward to the end and be done with it. But because I'm watching those shows, they were talking about No Holds Barred. And I have not watched No Holds Barred probably since the movie came out in 1989. It's a free movie on YouTube with ads, so I went ahead and I could not watch the whole thing, but I skimmed through some of it. And I think No Holds Barred is proof that wrestling fans in the 1980s would watch anything that starred a professional wrestler. Hulk Hogan said, I don't know, a year or two ago, that he and Vince McMahon sat down and just spitballed that whole movie plot. They wrote the plot for the movie. I think for once Hulk Hogan was telling the truth because that looks like something that Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan would have spitballed. I cannot recommend it. It is not in my recommendations this week, but No Holds Barred is free with ads on YouTube if you're trying to punish yourself for something. So the topic for this week's episode, and you will get Ad Santel's tour of Japan before December's over, I promise you. That was actually going to be the topic this week, and I would just get Trey and or Caleb's review of Survivor Series at some other time. But I was listening to a couple of historians talk about the double cross of Big Wayne Munn by Stanislaus Obisco in Philadelphia in April of 1925. And I've bought a couple of books from the one historian, and the other historian is young and up and coming and will be producing historical research on professional wrestling long after I'm gone. And I am going to buy the book they're working on right now. So when I say what triggered my thought for this podcast, it's one statement they made when they were talking about all kinds of different historical things in professional wrestling that I was like, well, that's not quite right. But what I think they were doing was conflating it with another very famous double cross in professional wrestling history. So we're going to talk about both of those. And realize when you are doing historical research and writing about professional wrestling history, you don't know what you don't know until you've researched and found out, oh, that's not quite how people said it was in the past. And I actually made an assumption when I wrote Gotch versus Hackenschmidt because I knew Adolf Ernst was a protege of George Hackenschmidt. I thought he had been a protege of Hackenschmidt's in Europe and he had come to the United States with Hackenschmidt. That is not correct. He was born in Germany, but Ad Santel's family moved to Chicago, Illinois sometime in his childhood, and he actually started wrestling amateur for the Turners. So the Turners was a German physical culture society that focused on gymnastics, wrestling, boxing, weight training, and almost all major cities in the United States with any kind of sizable German population had a Turnavarian Hall. In St. Louis, we had at least two, and I think there was a third one out in West County or West St. Louis, one of the two. But we had a Southside Turnavarian Hall, which still exists as an apartment building in South St. Louis. And then we had a north side Turnavarian Hall, which eventually became so decayed, and they had a fire there that it collapsed and was torn down a few years ago. Adolf Ernst was a wrestler for one of the Turnavarian halls in Chicago, and he learned professional wrestling initially from Charlie Olson, who was a light heavyweight but very dangerous hooker and shooter from the 1900s and the 19 teens. Hackenschmidt comes to the United States in 1911, wrestles with Ernst, likes him, and takes him under his wing. So I think the slams that Ernst was known for later on in his career, particularly when he was going against judo and jiu-jitsu black belts, those I believe he learned from Hackenschmidt. So this is in no way taking a shot at any historians. I have thoroughly researched this topic because I wrote Double Crossing the Gold Dust Trio in 2021, and then I just finished this year the Divided Championship, which was after the Double Cross, the almost 3 years where the title was divided, where both Joe Stecker and Ed Strangler Lewis were claiming the title. So I know this period so well because I've researched it so in depth. So let's set up the double cross, and then I'll tell you the one comment that I was off, but I believe was off because it was conflated with another double cross that we'll talk about in a second. So the double cross of Wayne Big Munn actually has its origins back in 1921. Well, actually, let's go back to 1920. So in December 1920, Ed Strangler Lewis wins his first recognized world title. He and Vladek Zabisco, I think, each claimed like an interim world title during the time Earl Caddock was in Europe. Nobody really recognizes that. Really, the title lineage went from Stecker to Caddock, back to Stecker when Stecker beat him in early 1920. And then Ed Strangler Lewis beat Joe Stecker in December of 1920 for the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. I had heard previously to researching that Stecker didn't want to drop the belt to Lewis, and that Lewis shot on him in that match and beat him legitimately. But that was a worked match. Lewis and Stecker wrestled 5 contests in their career. The first 4 were before 1919. So they wrestled 3 matches that all went to draws and were all very, very long. One was a 5-hour draw. In Chicago in 1919, during the 4th match, Lewis finally got a fall on Stecker. In the 3 matches before that, nobody got a fall on anybody. And while it was a 2 out of 3 fall match, they had agreed that if one of them gained a fall during this match, then the other person would be declared the winner. So after 2 hours, if either one of them had scored a fall and the match went 2 hours or longer, whoever scored the one fall would be the winner. And that was Lewis scored it like an hour and 45 minutes into the match. I think they went it went over 2 hours. They went another maybe till 2 hours 15 minutes, 2 hours 30 minutes, and finally the referee had enough and said this is the end of the match. And by the agreement, Lewis won anyway. So that kind of settled their rivalry. After that, they worked the match that they wrestled in 1920, and they may have had some matches before that in 1920 and 1919. But after they settled there who was the best guy in the ring, they did not have another contest until they had the match in February 1928 in St. Louis to settle the divided championship. And that actually started out as a shoot and I believe ended as a work. In December 1920, Ed Strangler Lewis defeats Joe Stecker for the world title. Lewis had a rivalry with 2 professional wrestlers. One was Joe Stecker. And that was a rivalry not based on animosity, not based on dislike. They were the 2 top wrestlers in the 19 teens, and Stecker was originally a little bit ahead of Lewis. And then Lewis caught up and got ahead of Stecker. And Lewis, for whatever reason, because he always said that he found Joe Stecker to be a nice, admirable guy, and they did work matches after they settled the divided championship, they would wrestle each other multiple times after that in worked matches. But Lewis didn't care for Stecker personally based on their rivalry to be the top person. The other person that Lewis had no use for whatsoever was Vladik Zbyszko, Stanislaus Zbyszko's younger brother. Lewis dropped the belt to Stanislaus Zbyszko in a worked match in April or May of 1921, and Stanislaus Zbyszko held the title for almost a full year. And then in March or April of 1922, Lewis took the title back, worked match, and he held it from that April or no, I think it was March. I think March 1922 to January of 1925. And during that all that time, from December 1920, when he was the world champion for the 5 months, and then when he got the title back in March of 22 to January 1925, Lewis froze Joe Stecker and Vladik Zbyszko out of the world title picture based on his personal animosity with Vladik Zbyszko and his rivalry with Joe Stecker. Almost all of the wrestling matches between Vladik Zbyszko from the first time Lewis wrestled him in 1914 until the 1920s when Lewis would not wrestle him anymore ended in fistfights. So when Lewis got mad and got sick of people pulling stuff on him in the ring, he did not stretch him. He did not put him in a submission hold and try to hurt him. He would punch them. In the Fall Guys, it's said that he legitimately injured Vladik Zbyszko's arm in a match in Rochester, New York, but I have yet to this day to be able to find that match. And the Fall Guy is full of bad information, so maybe that match never happened. I'm still looking, but I've never found any evidence that that occurred. But their very first match in Detroit in 1914, they got into a fist fight, and the police had to break it up. And these were all worked matches. They had a strong dislike for each other. So Stecker is mad because he's been frozen out of the world title for most of the past 5 years. The only title shots Joe Stecker got were with Stanislaus Zbyszko during the 10-month world title reign that Stanislaus Zbyszko had. Vladik Zbyszko being froze out ticked off Jack Curley, who was his promoter at the time and who wanted Zbyszko to have a run with the world title. But Lewis wanted nothing to do with wrestling Vladik Zbyszko. He wasn't going to let him get a big payday that you would get from wrestling the world champion. And Billy Sandow, Lewis's manager, and Lewis were not fans of Jack Curley because Jack Curley would cheat anybody, and everybody knew that. When these promoters got into these alliances or the wrestling trusts that they always talked about in the teens, 20s, and 30s, those trusts were oh, very fleeting because these guys, when they saw an opportunity to double cross each other, particularly if there was a lot of money involved, would stab each other in the back so quick it'd make your head swim. So all of Jack Curley's alliances were marriages of convenience at best. When Billy Sandow gets the world title back on Lewis in 1922, he decides they're going to be a lot less dependent on Jack Curley as a power broker in professional wrestling. And Sandow starts to help set up promotions throughout the United States, particularly in the Midwest. So he helps Tom Law start a promotion in Wichita. He helped Sam Avey start a promotion in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And these promoters, a lot of times, would be more beholden to Sandow than Jack Curley. Curley is upset because he can't get the belt on Zbyszko. And the Stecker brothers are ticked off because Joe is frozen out of the world title picture as well. And then the Sandow management group, but it's really becoming a sort of a promotion too, because Well, they probably weren't known as this at the time. In history, this group is known as the Gold Dust Trio. Right prior to Lewis getting the title back in March 1922, Martin Farmer Burns, who had trained Frank Gotch, was still a well thought of professional wrestling trainer, sends a young wrestler from Colorado to work with Billy Sandow. And he recommends him because, one, he's a legitimate wrestler. Burns has taught him how to hook and shoot, and that he could be a good training partner for Lewis to keep Lewis sharp where he is not in danger of being double crossed. The reason Lewis and uh, Sandow could do so much of what they wanted is because nobody could beat Lewis in a legitimate contest. He would just shoot on him and, you know, say, okay, we're going to wrestle. And most guys would say, Ed, I can't beat you. And they would just go along with whatever the finish was that Lewis changed it to. Mont is also a heck of a shooter and a hooker. As a matter of fact, Ed Strangler Lewis would tell Luthez, his protege, that there were only two wrestlers that he worried about beating him in an actual shoot. One was Joseph Toots Mont, and the other one was Stanislaus Zbyszko, who was 45 years old in 1925. Born in 1880, they always build him as older, and he looked older. He was 41 when he won the world title, and he would be 42 when he lost it back to Lewis. So in 1925, he is 45 years old, 44 going on 45. And Billy Sandow is promoting this new big wrestler named Wayne Big Munn, a former University of Nebraska Cornhusker football player who does not know anything about amateur wrestling, professional wrestling. He was a football player. So Toots Mont, oh, I trailed off and forgot to finish my thought with what the other thing was that they were taking off promoters with. So let me rewind and then we'll get back to Dwayne Big Mont. The Goldust Trio, once Mont joined them, one of the things Martin Farmer Burns had told Billy Sandow was that Mont has a great mind for the business. And even Luthez, who hated Mont's guts, said Mont knew the wrestling business and he helped revolutionize it. And one of the ideas Mont had was because Sandow managed a bunch of wrestlers, he had a bunch of wrestlers under contract, is that from now on, when people want Lewis at the top of the card to go against their top wrestler, the rest of the card will be filled out by our wrestlers. So if Ed Lewis came to New York and defended his title, probably against Joseph Toots Mont, because he wouldn't put it on the title against Zbyszko, who was Curley's biggest wrestling star, then the rest of the card would not be filled out by regular New York wrestlers, which Curley had, but would be filled out by wrestlers that worked for the Sandow promotion. So you'd have John the Nebraska Tiger Man Pesek wrestle somebody. This really made promoters like Jack Curley, Paul Bowser, even a Tom Pax in St. Louis, who had Jim Londas as a big attraction at that time, very angry because they have 6 or 7 wrestlers that wrestle for them that whenever the world champion comes to town, they can't get on the card because you have to put the Sandow employed wrestlers on the card. So they were booking the world champion out and all these wrestlers like a vaudeville slate. Vaudeville would book the vaudeville circuit. There were multiple vaudeville companies. So they have a company, they're going to book their show into your town, let's say for a week. They will book their company into your theater in your town, say you're in Philadelphia, for a week. But if you have local acts with a lot of the big cities like Philadelphia, New York did, they can't get on the car on the show that week because you've got all of the talent that work for that vaudeville company that tour around performing that week, and they're going to be paid and they're going to get all the money. That's the same way Mont had, let's do book the wrestling the same way. Sandow liked it, and that's what they were doing. So they have really made a lot of the established promoters like Bowser, Curley, Ray Fabiani in Philadelphia, Tom Pax in St. Louis, Carnation Lou Darrow in Los Angeles, made these guys really angry because now they've got wrestlers that they can't book, and those wrestlers may leave them if that happens too frequently. So you have a recipe where there are a lot of people that are disgruntled with the Goldust Trio or the Sandow Promotional and Management Group, whatever you want to call them. Now let's go to Big Wayne Munn. Big Wayne Munn cannot wrestle, but Joseph Tootsmont and Ed Strangler Lewis get him to a point where he can have a credible wrestling match as a performer. But if a credible professional wrestler, a shooter or hooker, goes up against Munn, Munn is helpless. Sandow wants to put the world title on Munn because what a huge draw he is. In Kansas City, he's regularly drawing 10 to 12,000 fans to the convention hall, and I think it was only supposed to really hold 10, but he drew bigger crowds than that a couple of times to the convention center. Sandow, because of greed, wants to put the title on Munn, which both Mont and Lewis are dead set against because they said he's helpless. He couldn't defend himself against the most basically skilled wrestler. He's just big. Pesek, who was 184 pounds, would have ate Munn's lunch, and Munn's 260 pounds. So they're dead set against this. Sandow says, no, 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 we'll be fine. I will only put him with wrestlers that are signed to us and who are loyal. Despite the fact that they had frozen Vladik Zabisco out of the world title, Stanislaus and Vladik were very close. They lived together when he first came back to the United States. When Stanislaus's wife passed away and he was in his 70s, he went to live with Vladik on Vladik's farm in near St. Joseph, Missouri, with Vladik and his wife. They were always very close. Despite that, Sandow trusted Stanislaus Zabisco. And as a matter of fact, his first title defense, not against Lewis or Mont, was against Zabisco, who put Munn over. Now, they were careful, particularly in the beginning, that Mont and Pesek, who was under contract to the Sandow promotion, would always be on the cards with Munn. So if something happened, they could intervene. And this is one of the reasons Pesek would leave the Sandow promotion, is he resented having to basically send off anybody that showed up to challenge Munn. So if you showed up to challenge Munn, Mont or Pesek would say, you got to beat us first. Well, very few people could beat either one of them, so Munn was basically safe. Pesek got annoyed with that very quickly. Sandow books Zabisco for a card with, or I'm sorry, for a match with Stanislaus Zabisco. So Munn and Zabisco are going to wrestle again in Philadelphia. And the only person on the card who is a shooter or a hooker is John the Nebraska Tiger Man Pesek. If Pesek had got involved, there's no guarantee he could have beat Zabisco. The match is a 2 out of 3 fall match. It's set for Philadelphia. Ray Fabiani is the promoter. And Zabisco goes out for the match with Munn. It was a 3-match card, if I remember. Pesek was in the co-main event or semi-wind-up. And the only person there from the management group is Max Bauman, Billy Sandow's younger brother. Billy Sandow's not there. Ed Strangler Lewis is not there because he just got back from Europe. And Toots Mont is not there. So it's only Pesek and Max Bauman from the Goldust Trio promotion. And it becomes apparent quite early that Zabisco is not going along with the prearranged finish. And he beats Munn for the first fall, as Munn looks very stunned. Munn goes back to the back and tries to tell the doctor he's not feeling good, blah, blah, blah. He's got a fever. And the doctor says, you got a slight arm strain, but you're fine. Sends him back out there. Zabisco never leaves the ring. So normally during the intermission for 15 minutes, the wrestlers leave the ring. He did not leave the ring. He just stood out in the ring. And Max Bauman comes out to the ring to try to talk to him, and Zabisco just shakes his head a couple times and won't even engage with him. So he's staying at the ring. Munn comes back out. Zabisco pins him again. He is now the world heavyweight champion in 2 straight falls. And one of the false stories about this match that had always existed before double crossing the Goldust Trio was that Zabisco pinned Munn repeatedly until the referee who worked for the Goldust Trio, which was true, finally had to declare that Zabisco was the winner. Zabisco just pinned him in 2 straight falls. And the referee was scared of riots, probably, which is why he counted the fall. He didn't want to. And he counted the both falls. Zabisco is now the new world champion. And to show that this was all planned beforehand, and this is the one statement I'm going to take exception with, I didn't look this back up again, but between 10 and 15 Philadelphia police officers come to the ring and escort Zabisco to the back. And then they escort Zabisco from the arena to the train station. So Zabisco and his co-conspirators were concerned about the promoters or the Goldust Trio trying to do something to him after he had double-crossed Munn. And this is where the one thing I wanted to take issue with. One of the historians said, and Zabisco then went and sold it to the highest bidder, which was Jack Curley, for $50,000. And what that is that's a conflating with another famous double cross we'll talk about in just a second. The actual double cross of Big Wayne Munn was planned out in advance. They did it in Philadelphia for a reason, because the only people that were supposed to be there that night were Bauman and Pesic, and they knew that. And Stanislaus Zabisco did not just say, well, I'm going to beat this schlub and then sell the title. He knew going into that match he was going to beat Munn, and he was going to get $50,000 from Joe Stecker and the other conspirators. The Stecker brothers put up 10,000. The other 40,000 came from Curley's group. So the people that were involved in this conspiracy, for sure, 100% were the Stecker brothers, the Zabisco brothers, and Jack Curley. Other people have been rumored to have been involved, but no one knows for sure. So Jack Curley and Paul Bowser did not get along. Everybody suspected Bowser might, remember, these are marriages of convenience, that Bowser might have been involved, as well as Ray Fabiani, who was a Philadelphia promoter, because it would have taken one of those two to probably get the police to be there to escort Zabisco back and everything. But Bowser was also one of the first people, if he was involved with the conspiracy, to break with them, because he was involved with Sandow in an attempted double cross of Stecker early on in 1926. Remember, this all occurs in Philadelphia, this double cross, in April of 1925. In May of 1925, Zabisco drops the title to Joe Stecker in St. Louis at SLU Field in front of 17,000 fans in 2 straight falls. So now Joe Stecker is the recognized world champion, except in Illinois and Michigan, because Billy Sandow pulled some political behind the scenes maneuvering and got the Illinois State Athletic Commission and the Michigan Commission to refuse to recognize Zabisco's defeat of Munn. So Munn was still technically the world champion, and Lewis would beat Munn on the same. It was Memorial Day, 1925. Both these matches occurred. Michigan City, Indiana, in front of 15,000 fans. Lewis beats Munn for the world title. So now you've got two competing world title claimants for almost 3 years. Because it occurred, because the title switch between Zabisco and Stecker occurred in St. Louis, there was some suspicion Tom Pax might have been involved. However, no one knows for sure because they later agreed to have the reunification match in St. Louis in February 1928. And the only other city that was really in serious consideration at the time was Philadelphia, because in 1927, and this is how you know that, okay, they're getting ready to settle this, because there was some reproachment between the two camps after them just refusing to deal with each other for the first year and a half, almost 2 years of the divided championship. In 1927, both Lewis and Stecker appear on cards in Philadelphia for Ray Fabiani, and both wrestlers appear for cards in St. Louis for Tom Pax. They did both wrestle, so for the rest of the divided championship, they did not wrestle in the same towns. So Stecker wrestled in Philadelphia. Lewis never wrestled in Philadelphia till 1927. Stecker wrestled in Los Angeles. So did Lewis, but Lewis did not wrestle in Los Angeles for Carnation Ludero. He wrestled for a upstart promotion that Sandow tried to help get started. Kenneth Dix was the promoter at first, and he very quickly turned it over to someone else, and it only lasted for a few cards. The Outlaw promotion never took off, so they didn't wrestle in Los Angeles again for quite a while. And then in Chicago, there were already two established promotions, and they just wrestled for the other promotions. They didn't wrestle for the same promotion in Chicago. A lot of people think, ooh, New York City, the mecca of wrestling. No, actually, the two biggest towns in the 20s would probably surprise people, because it was probably Kansas City, which, when you think of Central States wrestling or professional wrestling and how bad it was in the 1980s, but in the 1920s, Kansas City was a big drawing town, and they would normally draw between 8 and 12,000 fans. And Chicago was the other one. Chicago normally could draw, in the teens, 10, 15,000. And later on, they would draw at ballparks in the 30s with Jim Londos. So those were really the two biggest drawing towns, but they never wrestled in the same towns until they got to the where they were going to uh, settle the title dispute. And the other person who may have been involved in the conspiracy was Carnation Ludero, and the evidence there is a little stronger because Lewis never wrestled for Darrow again until after the whole thing was settled. And Darrow probably gave him money to end the beef between the two of them. So we know for sure the Stecker brothers, the Zabisco brothers, and Jack Curley were involved in that for sure. And then you could have had Pax, Fabiani, Paul Bowser, and Carnation Ludero involved as well. The $50,000 that Zabisco got to drop the title to Stecker, 10,000 came from the Stecker brothers, and 40,000 of it came from others. I have a real hard time seeing Jack Curley part with $40,000 of just his money. I'm sure he had partners in with him on this, so there were more conspirators. However, I told you the only thing I took issue with was them saying he sold it to the highest bidder. Stanislaus Bisco knew going in that after he beat Munn, he was going to get $50,000 from Stecker, Curley, and whoever else was involved in the conspiracy to drop the title to Stecker. In the 1930s, Dano O'Mahony was one of the biggest box office draws in professional wrestling, particularly in Boston and other areas with a significant Irish population. Dano Me Boy was one of the most popular wrestlers ever in professional wrestling. His misfortune was, just like Wayne Big Munn, he was a pure performer. I think he had been a rower in Ireland with a wonderful physique, and who had been taught how to have a credible performance. He was a performer, not a legitimate wrestler, but he could perform. a competent wrestling match, and the fans loved him. Dick Shikat was a shooter and a hooker, legitimate wrestler, tough guy who did not like Dano O'Mahony, number one. Number two, he had a grudge going back 4 years because in 1930 or 1931, he had put up the deposit to be the world champion. So when you were the person selected to be the world champion in the 1920s, 1930s, all the way up into the 1980s, you would pay a certain amount of money. At that time, I think the going rate was ten or $15,000. In the 80s, I think it was 25 or $50,000. But you would deposit that money with, in the case of the 80s, it was with the NWA, but with the wrestling trust, so to speak. You would put this money up. And if you refused to lose the title to who they told you to lose the title to, you would forfeit that money. And that was not unusual for matches as well. When they wanted to put Landis and Lewis at Chicago in Comiskey Park, and they drew 34,000 fans, Landis would not get in the ring with Lewis until Lewis put up $50,000 to say he would not shoot on and double cross Jim Landis. This is not an unusual arrangement. Well, Dick Shikat put up the ten or $15,000 because he was supposed to be the next person to be the world champion. However, through the political machinations going on at the time, they ended up putting the world title on Ed Don George instead of putting it on Dick Shikat. And Dick Shikat was ticked off. He was the tough guy. So he went and confronted Ed Strangler Lewis and Joseph Toots-Mondt, who he'd put the money up with, about why they had not dropped the title to him. And Lewis tried to explain what had happened, and it was a promotional decision that they didn't have 100% control over. They'd give him his money back. But Shikat had a temper, Lewis had a temper, and they end up having a punch up, which probably would have ended right there. But Joseph Toots-Mondt, one of the more disreputable people in professional wrestling, which is saying quite a bit, decides that he's going to start putting knots on Shikat's head while Shikat is engaged with Lewis. And Sucker punches him several times, and Shikat got beat up pretty good. Shikat never forgot that, and he always harbored that grudge against the Wrestling Trust that they had not put the title on him in 1931. So they put him in the ring with Dano O'Mahony. Now, they should have known not to do that. Number one, O'Mahony was going to be hopeless if Shikat shot on him, which he did. Number two, Shikat had clearly demonstrated he did not like Dano O'Mahony 9 months prior to that because O'Mahony was down on his hands and knees on the mat, and Shikat football kicked him in the side so hard that it broke one of his ribs, and the referee disqualified him. And that was 6 to 9 months before this match. But greed, remember, these guys are greedy. And Paul Bowser saw a huge payday by putting Dick Shikat in the ring with Dano O'Mahony in Madison Square Garden. So that's what they did. Shikat goes in there, puts a hammerlock on uh, O'Mahony and cranks it and hurts his shoulder. But the referee knows that that's not supposed to be the end. So at first, and I think it was a one fall match, which was the other odd thing about it. I think at first, Shikat cranked that thing. O'Mahony is verbally giving up in the ring, but the referee will not call the match because he knows that that's not supposed to be the finish, that O'Mahony is supposed to retain the world championship. Well, O'Mahony is screaming and begging him, end the match, end the match, end the match. And Shikat's cranking this hold. Well, now the fans start booing because they know something's not right and something's not going on correctly. So they start booing and everything and start throwing the seat cushions. And there was a thing in the 20s and 30s when the fans were unhappy. I guess it was normal that you had a seat cushion on the seats at the ballparks or the theaters or wherever you went. And when they were mad about something, they'd start throwing the seat cushions. Well, when a couple of seat cushions came in, the referee realized these fans are probably going to kill me if I don't end this pretty quick. And Mahoney, his shoulder is already hurt, is begging him to end the match. End the match. He finally tapped Dick Shikat on the back and named Shikat the winner. And Shikat had no plan when their shot on O'Mahony. He was just going to take the title legitimately. And then he went, oh, now what am I going to do? And initially, I had heard from other sources that he had a breakdown in the ring because he figured that the wrestling trust was going to kill him. I have never found any evidence that that actually happened. I think that's an apocryphal tale. But what he did do was he's like, I got to get rid of this title before they do kill me. So he did put it up for the highest bidder. That's why I think they're conflating the two double crosses. And Billy Sandow, I believe, was the one who paid him the money. But Paul Bowser's ticked off about this because he controlled the championship and he didn't want Dick Shikat to have the title. But he is the manager of record for Dick Shikat. So he starts booking Shikat, double booking him. So he's booking him in Baltimore for one match and booking him in Philadelphia for another match on the same night, which he can't possibly get to. And as soon as he no-shows a couple of these, Bowser reports him to the athletic commission and gets him suspended. Breaking all the rules, Shikat decides I'm not standing for this, and he sues Bowser and the members of the Wrestling Trust from trying to keep him from earning a living as a professional wrestler. And the work nature of professional wrestling gets exposed in this court case. So it was just an absolute disaster for the business all the way around. So I wanted to do a review this week, but not a review like I've done in the past where we've reviewed old wrestling from maybe the 50s to the 80s. But I wanted to look at Jack Curley's one of his early wrestling cards from 1917. And this card is from December 17th, 1917 at Lowe's Lexington Theater in New York City. This was a venue that held about 3,100 attendees or fans. And this card drew 3,000 fans. So it was almost a sellout. If Caddick is not in the Army, he will be in the Army pretty soon. So this even could have been one of those world title matches when Lewis and Zbyszko were trading the interim world title. But the very first match is Harold Christensen defeats Pierre LeBelge in 13 minutes 48 seconds. And Christensen is a international wrestler, and some of these wrestlers you'll see are wrestlers that were in the 1915 International Wrestling Tournament or came to New York just right after this, would be in New York, for the duration of World War One, and then would go back to Europe. And then we had a New England mainstay, John Freeburg, and he wrestled Yusuf Hussein to a time limit draw. Yusuf Hussein was a pretty skilled shooter and hooker who Martin Farmer Burns worked with when he came to the United States. And he is the wrestler that Burns took with him to to Dodge, Nebraska, to test a young Joe Stecker to see how good he was. And Stecker was in the process of submitting Yusuf Hussein when Yusuf Hussein bit him to get himself disqualified and then jumped out off of the mat and refused to get back on the mat with Stecker because he realized he was in way over his head. And that's when Burns realized Stecker was legitimately the real deal. And then you have a match where George Manich defeated Frank Levitt in 20 minutes, 22 seconds. Frank Levitt would go on to be Man Mountain Dean in the late 20s and early 30s. But in this match, he's just a young up-and-coming wrestler. Then Charles Pospisil, who is Carl Popsili, who was a well-known international wrestler, and he defeated Sulo Heavenpaw, who came to the United States for the International Wrestling Tournament in 1915, but would be someone who would be in silent films and a regular actor on Broadway. And he would stay in the United States and would be a regular on the Broadway theater circuit until his passing in 1952. And then the main event, and what undoubtedly drew the crowd, was Ed Lewis defeated Vladik Zabisco in 1 hour, 24 minutes, and 33 seconds. And it looks like it was a one fall match. The average age of the wrestlers was 28.7 years. The match was a 5 match card, was pretty unusual in that time. So I think that's going to be it. Next episode, I am planning on talking about Ad Santel's tour of Japan in 1921. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye bye.